So last weekend, we talked about the incredible miracle that Christ does when he takes people that have been separated by animosity and suspicion, and he creates new people that are bound together in grace and mercy and love. And we talked about the fact that there is more to salvation than saving us from sin. Christ's work doesn't just end there, saving us from sin. You see, when we lean into him by faith, we find that he takes the pieces of us that are fearful and divisive, and he removes them. And he replaces fear with love, he replaces judgment with grace, and he replaces condemnation with mercy. So if your version of Christianity is leading you to be more fearful, more judging, and more condemning, it is not true Christianity. And this is the thought that Paul ends the passage with that we read last week. You don't have it on the paper, I'll just read it for you. Paul says this: that's plain enough, isn't it? You're no longer wandering exiles. This kingdom of faith is now your home country. You're no longer strangers or outsiders. You belong here with as much right to the name Christian as anyone. God's building a home. He's using us all, irrespective of how we got here, in what he's building. He used the apostles and the prophets for the foundation. Now he's using you, fitting you brick by brick, stone by stone, with Jesus Christ as a cornerstone that holds all the parts together. And we see it taking shape day after day, a holy temple built by God, all of us built into it, a temple in which God is quite at home. That's how Paul ends chapter 2 of this letter of Ephesians. Now, the letter, as I've described it, was written by one person with one overarching idea. And so today's text that we're going to read kind of launches off from that idea of insiders and outsiders. And in typical Pivot 613 fashion, we're going to read a long passage of the Bible, so let's read it together. Ephesians 3. Make sure you have a handout near you or that you can share or something. Verse 1, this is why Paul, am in jail for Christ, having taken up the cause of you outsiders, so-called. I take it that you're familiar with the part I was given in God's plan, including everybody. I got the inside story on this from God himself as I wrote you in brief. As you read over what I've written to you, you'll be able to see for yourselves into the mystery of Christ. You see, none of our ancestors understood this. Only in our time has it been made clear by God's Spirit through his holy apostles and the prophets of this new order. The mystery is that people who have never heard of God, and those who have heard of him all their lives, what I've been calling outsiders and insiders, stand on the same ground before God. They get the same offer, same help, same promises in Christ Jesus. The message is accessible and welcoming to everyone across the board. This is my life's work, helping people understand and respond to this message. It came as a sheer gift to me, a real surprise, God handling all the details. When it came to presenting the message to people who had no background in God's way, I was the least qualified of any of the available Christians. God saw to it that I was equipped, but you can be sure that it had nothing to do with my natural abilities. And so here I am, preaching and writing about things that are way over my head, the inexhaustible riches and generosity of Christ. My task is to bring it out in the open and make plain what God, who created all this in the first place, has been doing in secret behind the scenes all along. Through the followers of Jesus like yourself, gathered in churches, this extraordinary plan of God is becoming known and talked about even among the angels. All this is proceeding along lines planned by God and then executed in Christ Jesus. When we trust in him, we're free to say whatever needs to be said, bold wherever we need to go. So don't let my present trouble on your behalf get you down. Be proud. My response is to get down on my knees before the Father, the magnificent Father who parcels out all heaven and earth. I ask him to strengthen you by his Spirit, not a brute strength, but a glorious inner strength, that Christ will live in you as you open the door and invite him in. And I ask that with both feet planted firmly on love, you'll be able to take in with all the followers of Jesus the extravagant dimensions of Christ's love. Reach out and experience the breadth. Test its length. Plumb the depths, rise to the heights, live full lives, full in the fullness of God. God can do anything, you know, far more than you could ever imagine or guess or request in your wildest dreams. He does it not by pushing us around, but by working within us, his Spirit deeply and gently within us. Glory to God in the church. Glory to God in the Messiah, in Jesus. Glory down all the generations. Glory through all millennia. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So, last weekend, I kind of went on a bit of a historical journey setting up this passage. And if you were interested in it, take a few minutes this week and just listen to it. I don't want to go over that ground because it's kind of well-worn here at Pivot 613. We talk a lot at this congregation about insiders and outsiders. However, before you tune me out, just hear me on this. It suffices to say that my sentiments mirror Paul's. It is an incredible thing to see the way the church was forced out of its exclusive ethnicity. And it is an extraordinary thing to see how the story of a carpenter, Jesus, has changed the history of the world. And it's even more exciting for me to see how God continues to break through and bring people that were historically at odds together. I don't know if you saw this in the news this week. This past week, the Southern Baptist Convention in the U.S. Had a very interesting turn of events. The SBC is one of the largest denominations that calls themselves Christians in North America. It is very powerful, it has a lot of money, and it is situated in the Bible Belt of the U.S. Now, one of the unfortunate things that has happened in the Bible Belt in the U.S. is that somehow, despite the permeation of a kind of Christianity, it has not really affected for better the attitudes of many people. And indeed, many pastors and congregations harbor bad feelings or bad sentiments towards black or brown people. And the reason for this is that the Southern Baptist Convention was actually started as a church movement to help prop up slavery. But last week, something interesting happened. Some of the members of the SBC started to voice alarm about the fact that the current political climate in the U.S., we all kind of know what's happening down there, has surfaced racist attitudes that were simmering beneath the surface in so many so-called evangelical churches. And these leaders had been seeing it resurface in ugly ways in their congregations, and some of them had started to see their colleagues preach from their pulpits in dog whistle terms. More to that, the SBC now has black and brown congregations. So this is a little bit of a situation that they're in. So a courageous pastor and his people put together a resolution for the SBC for them to consider. And this resolution would get them to repudiate in strong terms white supremacy, racism, slavery, and the so-called alt-right. As I mentioned, the SBC has a past rooted in slavery and ethnic exclusivity, and it has actually shown support for leaders that were in favor of racially repressive laws. And so what ended up happening this week is that there was a little bit of a discussion about it, and someone even tried to shove it off the table. But then the president of the convention finally put his foot down and said, no, we have to vote on this, and it has to be unanimous. There cannot be anyone holding out for this kind of ugliness. Now, they did pass it. For many people, I count myself among those, a resolution is not enough. It's a step, but it's not enough. Racial reconciliation does not happen just because of a resolution. But on the other side, on the other hand, as someone for whom God has changed long-held attitudes, I was still moved to read this article. I was moved by a few things, like, the courage and the honesty of the men and women who stood up and spoke to their denomination and said, this is wrong, it's been a part of our history, it needs to stop. I was moved by the honesty of the leaders who are still a long way off, they still have a long distance to cover, but they're trying to see that they uproot the negative seeds of racism affecting their community. They have a long way to go, they do. But I have hope that this resolution for the Southern Baptist Convention will result in even more action. And it is in moments like these that I marvel at the words of Paul. Hang with me as I make the connection between what we read and this thing that I just talked about. You see, Paul was thrown in jail at a particularly brutal time for Christians. Peter, who was one of his contemporaries, who was one of the earliest followers of Christ, had been thrown in jail, and he was imprisoned and executed in Rome at around the same time that Paul was. Many of Paul's contemporaries were executed just like he was, and many of them had their lives snuffed out trying to plant the work that Jesus had started. And the communities that they had started all along the Mediterranean were also experiencing deep persecution. They were hanging on by a thread. And this is why Paul wrote, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Thessalonians. He wrote a lot of letters to these congregations to encourage them through their really difficult times that they were going through. If you think about it, Paul in prison, waiting for his execution, writing letters to encourage a few people, 10 here, 20 there, maybe 100 over there. Paul had no way of knowing that the church would number in billions sometime later. He had no way of knowing. He had no way of knowing that the Roman Empire that was oppressing them and killing them would flip and one day become the Christian Roman Empire. He had no way of knowing that. He had no way of knowing that people would forget the name of the emperor that was ruling at the time that he was alive, but they would remember his name, and they would build cathedrals and name cities after him. He was just a prisoner in a cell writing letters. And yet, even in that moment, peering through a keyhole, he could see a glimpse of something extraordinary. And that's why he writes these lines that we read in verse 14. Let's look at it again. He says, my response is to get down on my knees before the Father, this magnificent Father who parcels out all of heaven and all of earth. I ask him to strengthen you by his Spirit, not a brute strength, but a glorious inner strength. Because you don't need brute strength when you're under prosecution, do you? You need inner strength. You need an inner strength that Christ will live in you as you open the door and invite him in. I ask that with both feet planted firmly on love, you'll be able to take in with all the followers of Jesus the extravagant dimensions of Christ's love. Reach out and experience the breadth. Test its length. Plumb the depths. Rise to the heights. Live full lives, full of the fullness of God. Verse 20, God can do anything, far more than you could ever imagine or guess or request in your wildest dreams. Excuse me. You see, Paul did not need to see billions of people call themselves Christians before he wrote these words. I think it's incredible. He did not need to see monuments built in his name before he wrote these words. All he could see was a small group of people at Ephesus under the threat of death, and yet living out the incredible reconciliation of Christ. And this was all the witness that he needed. To me, this is like the resolution at SBC. It seems like a small thing, especially for those of us that are woke about racial reconciliation. A resolution seems like a small thing. I mean, at Pivot 613, we are a Free Methodist congregation. We belong to a denomination that calls themselves Free Methodists. It started when a group of Christians said, enough with slavery. It is written into our DNA. So, for us, this racial reconciliation thing, we've been in this soup for a few hundred years now. But on the other hand, the SBC is a denomination that still has much to learn. But in spite of this, in spite of seeming insurmountable odds, there are glimpses of the Spirit of Christ breaking through in this denomination. You see, this is also the reason why I get down on my knees every week for Pivot 613. When we started this congregation, we had a very simple idea. Love is stronger than fear. We didn't want to build another congregation where the primary motivator was fear. More to that, we were persuaded that we would find people in this city, in this country, maybe a few, maybe many, who would resonate with this message. We were persuaded that there were other people who had been put off by anything to do with Christianity because they had had a negative reaction to the church when they'd run into people's fears. And we were convinced that if we just focus on the love part and not the fear part, that God would lead us to people that resonated with this. And so every week, we have you as a reminder that God is on the move and is changing hearts and is changing stories. Now, am I going to sit here and pretend that it would not be nice to be doing this in front of a congregation of thousands of people? No. I've done the thousands of people thing, and I know how sweet that deal is. I want to be honest. Some days, I want the big pulpit. But more than that, I want tens, maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands of people to find the love that casts out fear. That's what I'm more concerned about these days. Not so much the numbers, but that we actually get people to find love that casts out fear. And so for these past 3 years, I've been trying to reprogram my brain to understand that I don't need the crowds to be thankful. I just have to be thankful that I get the privilege of showing and sharing with you grace and mercy and love. And I have to say, it is the privilege of my life to be able to do that, to be able to relentlessly point you away from fear and towards love. And so, I get down on my knees and I ask God to strengthen you by His Spirit. Not a brute strength, but an inner strength. That Christ will live in you as you open the door and invite Him in. I ask that as you, with both feet firmly planted on love, that you'll be able to cast out fear. That you'll be able to find the extravagant dimensions of Christ's love. That you'll be able to find the transformative power of His love as your life is changed in ways that you could have never imagined. I pray for each of you relentlessly that you would reach out and experience the breadth of His love. That you would test the length, that you would plumb the depth, that you would rise to the heights. My prayer for you is that you live full lives in the love of God. I firmly believe that God can do anything, far more than we could ever imagine or request in our wildest dreams, just as it said in verse 20. Now, I don't know about you. Every time I've read this passage, I'm like, I can imagine a lot, man. I can imagine a lot. I can imagine a congregation where families are being restored by love. I can imagine a community that is being healed by love because at the center of this group is a group of people that refuse to walk in fear. I can imagine people being healed from addictions because Christ's love is completing them rather than the thing that they're turning to for completeness. I can imagine people being moved into action in service of less fortunate people. I can imagine mind-blowing acts of mercy. I can imagine people walking into our congregation and trying to figure out what's different about us and what fuels us. I can imagine people that have turned their backs on religion, finding Christ. Not finding religion, but finding Christ and His love. As I told you, I can imagine a lot. And yet Paul is saying something pretty astonishing. He's saying, you can imagine all you want, but your imagination is based on your experience. God can do so much more than you can imagine because He is outside of your experience. You see, Paul had never seen a church that numbered in the billions. He'd never seen it. Imagine what it is like. Imagine what it would be like for him, for God to just zap him out of heaven and to see what the work he did has managed to accomplish. We have no clue what God has in store for us because it is far more than we can guess or imagine. And this is where I'd like to end this week. Because many of us have been handed a faith that is small. Many of us have been handed a faith that is not more than we can ask or imagine. And for some of us, the disconnect has been in the fact that we've been handed something that says we have to be wealthy and healthy and rich and whatever. That's not the more than you can ask or imagine that Paul is talking about here. That is our Western programming, honestly, isn't it? I think Paul is talking about something different. The more than we can ask or imagine happens when God is working deeply in us. God is a gentleman. He doesn't push us around. Paul says that he does this work without pushing us around. I think that what Paul is talking about is an inward transformation. He's talking about a change inside of us that we don't even know needs changing. He's talking about a revolution inside of us that we presently have no idea about. I think he's talking about an attitude change, maybe a lifestyle change, maybe even a long-held prejudice being removed, or a permanent, long-lasting change that is only revealed when we lean into God and trust him to work it out in us. And so my job this afternoon is to invite you to lean in. This is what this Going Deep series is about. God can do more than you can ever ask or imagine, but he doesn't push you around. You have to lean in. You have to trust him. You have to walk towards his love. I can't tell you what will happen when you do this because your journey is uniquely yours. But I can guarantee one thing. It's not going to be what you expected, but it is going to be so much more than you deserve. So this afternoon, this is my invitation. Will you lean in? Will you go deep?